Welcome to the final video of this three-parter series, where I go over my choices of job candidates that could be added in the next expansion 7.0. In this video, we will be covering the Physical Ranged DPS role, the one I personally feel will be the second job added alongside Magical DPS. If you want to skip ahead to the job choices, I left a timeline in the description. Square Enix has added 2 new jobs with each expansion since Stormblood. When I looked at the numbers as well as the needs of the player base, I honestly couldn't fully decide between tank and physical ranged. This is the primary reason I decided to cover all 3 roles in this series. On screen you will see all the jobs added to the game as of Endwalker. Caster was the easy choice as we haven't got one since Stormblood. As for the second job, factoring job numbers alone would support the idea of a physical ranged. However, we can't only go by numbers, so I used my own player experience to try and come up with the answer. If you look at Party Finder, at least on my data center, you will see that there's usually a shortage of tanks. At the same time, whenever a group's recruiting, physical range would usually be the first to fill, as there's usually a lot more competition for spots in this role due to player statistics. By that logic, it would make sense to add another tank job, but this is only from my experience on one data center. Now, I'm not saying adding a 5th tank would fix everything, but it wouldn't hurt either. The right job being added may cause an influx of role switching. But enough about that, let's move on to the subject at hand. The Physical Ranged DPS role is comprised of the Bard, wielding a bow, the Machinist, which wields a gun, and the Dancer wielding a pair of chakrams. These jobs don't have the raw DPS output of the magical or melee roles, but make up for it with their toolkits of buffing other party members and the utility they bring to a group's composition. Choosing a 4th job to add to this category was a challenge for me, given the current job and weapon pools. First up, a job based on the Final Fantasy series. I ended up with a couple of great job options, but ultimately I went with the Chemist. I had explored the idea of a Chemist during Shadowbringers as a possible healer job, right up until Sage was announced. And it's fair to say I wasn't alone on this. When the announcement was about to happen, most of us honestly expected a Chemist to appear. The Chemist is a staple of many of the games in the series. One of its most popular abilities was Mix, where they mix multiple items together, producing the effect of both or something new. This would be augmented with the ability Throw, where they would throw this mixed item at the enemy or ally, triggering the item's effects, which could range from heals, buffs, status removal, status affliction, or just pure damage. I could honestly see Chemist being our next physical ranged, utilizing projectile items, along with abilities that combine them, triggering damage reduction or even buffs to the party, similar to how the rest of the physical ranged work. In terms of a weapon of choice, Chemists have wielded a variety of them in the series. But in keeping with the requirement of making all the jobs stand apart and be unique, I finally settled on the Racket. The Racket is a lesser known weapon, only seen once in the main series in Final Fantasy IX, and featuring in the Crystal Chronicles series. If you're not familiar with the Racket weapon, you might be thinking of tennis right now, but it's actually closer to the racket used in the game of lacrosse. The Racket is a ranged weapon where the wielder uses it to throw physical or magical projectiles. My idea is the Chemist would use their Racket for the throwing of both projectiles and their mixed items. It's the perfect weapon for them, giving them a ranged weapon for physical attacks, while also providing an easy way to throw larger items towards their destination. On the subject of items, the item system in FF14 is a bit of a mess right now, with many of the combat items we have never really seeing much use anymore, not since the early days of A Realm Reborn or when you're leveling a job. The mix skill with this system wouldn't work the same way as it did in the series, but a modified version of it that mixes between abilities the Chemist would have would be something very special and very unique. The Chemist is unique enough from the rest of the physical range that it would stand on its own, and maintains the spirit of the Final Fantasy series, making it, in my opinion, one of the top choices for a new physical range DPS. Now that we have a series pick, it's time for one based off the MMORPG genre. Ranged DPS classes are among the most popular types of classes to be added to most MMOs, But based on what we have currently right now and what's needed, I went with the Ranger. Ranger is one of the most common and popular classes you will see in the genre. Each game it appears in has their own unique spin on the idea. Most MMOs are based on high fantasy, and Rangers have been a centre point of this. My idea for a Ranger is a full-on ranged DPS, and its weapon of choice will be the rifle. A weapon that is both familiar to the genre, but unique enough that it can stand apart from the other 3 jobs that we currently have. This Ranger would focus on dealing damage from afar, but at a slightly reduced attack rate. This slower rate of attack would be compensated with increased potency. I took a bit of inspiration from what Machinist and Bard used to be back in Heavensward, when they had castable abilities in their rotations. These old physical ranged are jobs that are missed by many, myself included. I was a huge fan of the original Machinist in Heavensward. A lore excuse for this playstyle will be the rifle itself, which is not a rapid fire weapon due to its reload and bolt action. As for its playstyle, it would focus more on its positioning than the other 3, while also providing a series of enemy afflicting abilities, such as damage reductions or increased damage from the Ranger and the party. I could see this Ranger attacking at range using their rifle, to fire off not only the projectiles, but also improvised traps and snares. Now, while my pick for the Ranger was inspired by the MMORPG genre, it's actually appeared in many of the series games, including Final Fantasy XI, but like them, I put my own spin on the job. My inspiration from the rifle comes from FF14 directly. Since 2.0 launched, it's always been speculated that we would get a dedicated gun-wielding job. This was answered with Machinist in Heavensward, but not in the way many were expecting. If you've spent much time roaming around Wyrmlimion for example, you likely took note of the gun standard outside the Coral Tower. Hosted next to it is the Marauder standard. This is a holdover from the old game, and was theorized to be the beginnings of a musketeer job that never really got out of the development stages. Within the building, take note of the series of rifles lining the interior, and also around the city proper. It's definitive proof that these weapons exist and that we have access to them. From a lore point of view, if that musketeer guild still exists, their influence in Limsa seems to have dwindled, possibly with them leaving altogether and setting up in a different city we've yet to visit. This leaves the door open for such a guild to be our trainers for the Ranger or the Musketeer arts. And that does it for the Physical Ranged DPS role and a conclusion to this 3-part video series. Here's a quick recap on screen showing my choices, and I very much want to hear your opinion on them, or if you have any ideas of your own. Since I'm covering this topic so early, I'm looking forward to revisiting the topic later on, when we get closer to the announcement of the next jobs, so when they're announced we can see how close we were. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like to show it, and click subscribe if you haven't yet, because I have a ton more videos to come. Thanks all, and now, as always, have a good one.